Number 10. Wade and Sarah Ludemann. A love triangle turned fatal friendship can be one of life's greatest gifts. A bond built on trust, shared experiences, and mutual support. But when that trust is shattered, when jealousy and obsession take hold, even the closest relationships can spiral into tragedy. This is the story of Wade and Sarah Ludemann, two young women in Pinellas Park, Florida, whose lives became intertwined in a deadly love triangle that would end with one of them dead and the other behind bars for murder. In the spring of 2009, 18-year-old Wade found herself caught in an increasingly volatile situation involving her on-again, off-again boyfriend Joshua Camacho and another young woman named Sarah Ludemann. What began as typical teenage romantic drama would escalate into a pattern of threats, confrontations, and ultimately violence that shocked the Tampa Bay community. Rachel and Sarah had known each other through mutual social circles, and while they weren't best friends in the traditional sense, they moved in the same world of young people navigating relationships, social media, and the complex dynamics of young adulthood in a digital age. The trouble began when both young women became romantically involved with Joshua Camacho, a 19-year-old who seemed unable or unwilling to commit fully to either relationship. The situation created immediate friction between Rachel and Sarah, with both women feeling betrayed by the other's involvement with Joshua. What might have remained an unfortunate but common romantic conflict instead escalated through a toxic combination of social media harassment, threatening text messages, and increasingly aggressive confrontations. Wade, by multiple accounts, became obsessed with the situation, sending hundreds of threatening messages to Sarah Ludemann over the course of several months. The messages grew progressively more violent and explicit, with Rachel making clear threats about what she would do if Sarah didn't stay away from Joshua. Sarah, for her part, responded to many of these messages, engaging in the conflict rather than seeking help from authorities or removing herself from the situation entirely. Friends and family members later testified that both young women seemed unable to extract themselves from the drama, with pride and emotion overriding common sense and self-preservation. The situation reached its tragic conclusion on April 14, 2009, in the early morning hours when a confrontation between the two women turned deadly. According to witness testimony and evidence presented at trial, Sarah Ludemann and several friends drove to a location where they believed Wade would be, specifically seeking out a face-to-face confrontation. When the two groups encountered each other in a residential area of Pinellas Park, Wade was armed with a kitchen knife, which she later claimed she carried for self-defense given the ongoing threats and confrontations. What happened next unfolded in mere seconds but would have permanent consequences. During the confrontation, Wade stabbed Sarah Ludemann once in the chest, the knife penetrating Sarah's heart. Sarah collapsed immediately and was rushed to a nearby hospital, where she was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Wade fled the scene but turned herself in to police later that same day, accompanied by her attorney. The investigation that followed painted a picture of a conflict that had been building for months, with both young women participating in escalating hostility, but with Wade ultimately taking the step that crossed from threats into lethal violence. Detectives recovered hundreds of text messages between the two women, many containing explicit threats from Rachel, including messages where she stated she would kill Sarah if given the opportunity. During her trial, which began in July 2010, Wade's defense team argued that she had acted in self-defense, claiming that Sarah Ludemann and her friends had sought out the confrontation and that Rachel feared for her life. The prosecution, however, presented overwhelming evidence of premeditation, pointing to the months of threatening messages, Rachel's decision to arm herself with a knife, and witness testimony suggesting Rachel was the aggressor during the final confrontation. The jury heard testimony from friends of both women, from Joshua Camacho himself, and from investigators who had analyzed the extensive digital trail of threats and harassment. Text messages were read aloud in court, revealing the depth of rage and obsession that had consumed Wade in the months leading up to the murder. Sarah Ludemann's mother gave an emotional victim impact statement, describing her daughter as a vibrant young woman whose life was cut short over a romantic rivalry that should never have escalated to violence. After deliberating for 2.5 hours, the jury found Wade guilty of second-degree murder, rejecting the self-defense argument. The judge sentenced Wade to 27 years in prison, a sentence that would see her incarcerated until she was in her mid-40s. During the sentencing hearing, Rachel Wade offered an apology to Sarah's family, stating that she never intended for things to go as far as they did and that she wished she could take back that moment. The case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of social media harassment, the escalation of romantic conflicts, and the failure of young people to seek help before situations spiral out of control. Both families were left devastated, with Sarah Ludemann's family losing their daughter and Rachel Wade's family watching their own daughter face decades in prison. Legal experts who analyzed the case noted that had either young woman sought intervention from authorities, had restraining orders been obtained, or had adults in their lives been more aware of the severity of the conflict, Sarah Ludemann might still be alive today. The case also highlighted how social media and digital communication can amplify conflicts, making it easier to send threatening messages in the heat of emotion and creating a permanent record that can be used as evidence in criminal proceedings. Rachel Wade remains incarcerated in the Florida prison system, where she has reportedly participated in educational programs and expressed remorse for her actions. Sarah Ludemann's family established a foundation in her memory to raise awareness about teen violence and the importance of conflict resolution, hoping that their daughter's death might prevent similar tragedies in the future. Number 9. Shelia, Eddy, and Rachel Shoaf. The Skylar Neese murder in the hills of West Virginia. 3 teenage girls formed what appeared to be an unbreakable friendship, sharing secrets, dreams, and the typical experiences of adolescence. Skylar Neese, Shelia Eddy, and Rachel Shoaf were inseparable throughout their high school years in the small community of Star City, documenting their friendship on social media and spending countless hours together. To outsiders, they seemed like the epitome of teenage friendship, supporting each other through the challenges of school, family issues, and the social pressures that define those formative years. But beneath the surface of their friendship, resentment and betrayal were building toward an act of violence so calculated and cold-blooded that it would shock the nation and leave investigators struggling to understand how 2 young women could plan and execute the murder of their supposed best friend. Skylar Neese was a bright, ambitious 16-year-old with plans for college and a career in the medical field. She worked part-time at a local restaurant, maintained good grades, and was close with her parents, Mary and Dave Neese, who described her as their everything. Shelia Eddy and Rachel Shoaf were her closest companions, girls she had known for years and trusted implicitly. The 3 were so close that Skylar's parents welcomed Shelia and Rachel into their home regularly, never suspecting that these girls harbored any ill will toward their daughter. The first sign that something was wrong came on July 6, 2012, when Skylar's parents discovered she was missing from her bedroom. Surveillance footage from their apartment complex showed Skylar sneaking out just after midnight, getting into a car, and driving away. Her parents immediately knew something was wrong because Skylar, despite being a typical teenager, had never stayed out all night without telling them where she was going. They reported her missing within hours, launching a search that would consume the small community and eventually reveal a horrifying truth. For months, Shelia Eddy and Rachel Shoaf participated in the search for Skylar, appearing at vigils, posting messages of concern on social media, and even speaking to news media about their missing friend. Shelia, in particular, seemed distraught, tweeting messages about missing Skylar and hoping for her safe return. To Skylar's parents and to investigators, Shelia and Rachel appeared to be grieving friends desperate for answers about what had happened to their companion. The investigation initially focused on the possibility of a runaway situation or perhaps an abduction by someone Skylar had met online. Detectives interviewed Skylar's friends repeatedly, including Shelia and Rachel, who both claimed they had no knowledge of where Skylar might have gone or who she might have been with on the night she disappeared. The case grew cold as weeks turned into months with no sign of Skylar and no significant leads. Then, in January 2013, 6 months after Skylar's disappearance, Rachel Shoaf suffered what her family described as a nervous breakdown. Unable to live with the guilt of what she had done, Rachel confessed to her attorney and her parents that she and Shelia Eddy had murdered Skylar Neese. The confession was stunning not only because it revealed that Skylar was dead, but because it exposed the premeditated nature of the crime and the fact that her 2 best friends had been lying to investigators and to Skylar's parents for half a year. Rachel agreed to cooperate with authorities and led them to Skylar's remains, which had been hidden in a remote wooded area across the state line in Pennsylvania. According to Rachel's confession and the evidence that investigators subsequently gathered, the murder had been planned in advance by both Shelia and Rachel. On the night of July 5, 2012, the two girls picked up Skylar under the pretense of going for a drive and smoking marijuana, something the three friends had done together many times before. They drove to a secluded area in Pennsylvania, where at a prearranged signal, both Shelia and Rachel attacked Skylar with kitchen knives, stabbing her repeatedly until she died. They then attempted to conceal the body by covering it with branches and other debris before returning to West Virginia, where they began their months-long deception. The motive for the murder remained one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. According to court documents and statements from both perpetrators, there was no single dramatic incident that led to the murder. Instead, Rachel and Shelia claimed they killed Skylar because they didn't want to be friends with her anymore, a statement so banal and chilling that it became one of the most quoted aspects of the case. Further investigation suggested that the friendship had become strained, that Skylar knew secrets about Shelia and Rachel's relationship that they feared she might reveal, and that the two girls had convinced themselves that murder was preferable to the social complications of ending their friendship. The revelation devastated Skylar's parents, who had welcomed these girls into their home and trusted them implicitly. The community of Star City was shocked that two seemingly normal teenage girls could commit such a calculated murder, and the case sparked national discussions about teen violence, the influence of social media, and the warning signs that adults might miss when adolescent relationships turn toxic. Rachel Shoaf pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in May 2013 and agreed to testify against Shelia Eddy as part of a plea agreement. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 10 years. During her sentencing hearing, Rachel apologized to Skylar's family and expressed remorse for her actions, though Skylar's parents made clear that no apology could ever make up for the loss of their daughter. Shelia Eddy initially pleaded not guilty and seemed prepared to take the case to trial, maintaining her innocence even after Rachel's confession. However, in January 2014, faced with overwhelming evidence including Rachel's testimony, forensic evidence from the crime scene, and her own inconsistent statements to investigators, Shelia changed her plea to guilty to first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The case led to changes in West Virginia law, with Skylar's law being passed to reform the Amber Alert system to more quickly respond to missing children cases. Recognizing that the initial hours after a disappearance are critical and that the system had failed to activate quickly enough in Skylar's case. Skylar's parents became advocates for missing children and victims' rights, channeling their grief into efforts to prevent similar tragedies and to ensure that other families wouldn't experience the nightmare of their daughter being murdered by her supposed best friends. The psychological aspects of the case fascinated criminal behaviorists and forensic psychologists, who noted the rarity of females committing such a violent, premeditated murder and the unusual nature of the motive. The fact that both girls were able to maintain their deception for months, participating in the search for Skylar while knowing she was dead and where her body was located, suggested a level of sociopathic behavior that challenged assumptions about teenage psychology and moral development. Both Shelia Eddy and Rachel Shoaf remain incarcerated, with Rachel becoming eligible for parole in 2023, though her release remains uncertain. The case continues to be studied in criminal justice programs and remains one of the most disturbing examples of friendship betrayal in recent American criminal history. Number 8. Jodi Arias and Travis Alexander. Obsession masked as friendship. The relationship between Jodi Arias and Travis Alexander began as a whirlwind romance that quickly became complicated by jealousy, religious conflict, and an inability by either party to fully separate from each other despite recognizing the toxicity of their connection. While not best friends in the traditional sense, Jodi and Travis maintained a relationship that included elements of friendship alongside their romantic and sexual involvement, with Jodi repeatedly insisting they were close friends even after their romantic relationship officially ended. This blurred boundary between friendship, romance, and obsession would ultimately lead to one of the most sensationalized murder trials in recent American history. Jodi Arias met Travis Alexander in September 2006 at a business convention in Las Vegas, where both were involved in the multi-level marketing company Prepaid Legal Services. Travis was a motivational speaker and devout Mormon who was well-liked in his Mesa, Arizona community, known for his charisma, his dedication to his faith, and his aspirations to build a successful business. Jodi was drawn to Travis immediately, and within months she had converted to the Mormon faith and the two had begun a romantic relationship. Friends of Travis later testified that he seemed happy initially, but that the relationship quickly became intense and complicated. Jodi moved from California to Mesa to be closer to Travis, a decision that concerned his friends who felt she was too attached and that the relationship was moving too quickly. By the summer of 2007, Travis had ended the romantic relationship, telling friends that while he cared for Jodi, they were incompatible and that he wanted to focus on finding someone he could marry in the Mormon temple. However, the relationship didn't truly end. Travis and Jodi continued to communicate regularly, maintained a sexual relationship despite both professing commitment to Mormon principles of chastity, and remained deeply enmeshed in each other's lives even as Travis began dating other women. Jodi's behavior during this period raised red flags for many of Travis's friends. She would show up at his house uninvited, access his social media accounts, and became intensely jealous of any woman Travis showed interest in. Travis confided to friends that he felt guilty about continuing the sexual relationship with Jodi while dating other women, but he seemed unable or unwilling to completely cut ties with her. Text messages and emails recovered later showed a relationship characterized by passion, conflict, sexual intensity, and Travis's growing frustration with Jodi's possessive behavior. In early 2008, Jodi moved back to California, which Travis's friends hoped would allow him to move on. He began dating a woman named Lisa Andrews, and it appeared he was finally establishing boundaries with Jodi. However, Jodi remained obsessed, making the 10-hour drive from California to Arizona repeatedly to see Travis, often without his prior knowledge or invitation. Travis's friends reported incidents of stalking behavior, including Jodi peering through windows, slashing a girlfriend's tires, and sending anonymous threatening messages. Travis confronted Jodi about these incidents, but their relationship continued in a pattern of conflict and reconciliation that grew increasingly unhealthy. The murder occurred on June 4, 2008, in Travis Alexander's home in Mesa, Arizona. According to the evidence presented at trial, Jodi drove from California to Mesa, arriving in the early morning hours. She and Travis spent the day together, including engaging in sexual activity that was photographed. Later that afternoon, while Travis was showering, Jodi attacked him with both a knife and a gun. The medical examiner determined that Travis suffered 27 to 29 stab wounds. His throat was slashed from ear to ear, and he was shot in the head. The brutality of the attack suggested extreme rage and personal animosity. Jodi left Travis's body in the shower, cleaned up some of the evidence, and fled Arizona. She called Travis's phone multiple times in the following days, leaving voicemail messages asking why he wasn't answering, attempting to establish an alibi. When Travis's friends discovered his body 5 days later, the crime scene was horrific, with defensive wounds indicating Travis had fought desperately for his life. The investigation initially had few leads, but when detectives discovered photographs on a camera in Travis's washing machine, the case broke open. The camera contained time-stamped photos from June 4th, including intimate photos of Travis and Jodi earlier in the day, photos of Travis in the shower minutes before the attack, and then several accidental photos taken during the struggle that showed Jodi's leg, Travis's body, and blood throughout the bathroom. The photographic evidence was damning, placing Jodi at the crime scene at the exact time of the murder. When detectives contacted Jodi for questioning, she initially denied being in Arizona at all. When confronted with evidence placing her there, she changed her story, claiming masked intruders had broken in and killed Travis while she escaped. Finally, after hours of interrogation, she admitted to killing Travis but claimed it was in self-defense, alleging that Travis had been physically and sexually abusive and that she killed him during a violent confrontation. Her trial, which began in January 2013, became a media sensation, with court TV broadcasting every moment and millions following the proceedings. Jodi testified for 18 days, providing graphic details about her sexual relationship with Travis, alleging abuse, and claiming her actions were justified self-defense. The prosecution argued that the evidence showed clear premeditation, pointing to Jodi's rental of a car with dark interior to hide blood, her turning off her cell phone while in Arizona to avoid detection, her bringing weapons to Travis's home, and the extreme nature of the violence inflicted. The trial exposed intimate details of Travis and Jodi's relationship, including their sexual practices, Travis's internal conflict between his Mormon beliefs and his behavior, and Jodi's increasingly unstable mental state. Friends testified about Travis's fear of Jodi in the weeks before his death. Emails showed him calling her a sociopath, and expert witnesses debated whether Jodi suffered from personality disorders that might explain her behavior. After 5 months of testimony, the jury found Jodi Arias guilty of first-degree murder in May 2013, determining that the killing was premeditated. The penalty phase was more complicated, with the jury unable to reach a unanimous decision on whether to impose the death penalty. A second penalty phase jury also deadlocked, and ultimately the judge sentenced Jodi Arias to life in prison without the possibility of parole in April 2015. Travis Alexander's family, who had endured years of trial proceedings and appeals, finally had closure, though they made clear that no sentence could bring back their brother and son. The case sparked intense debate about domestic violence, with some arguing that Jodi's allegations of abuse were legitimate and others pointing to her documented pattern of lies and manipulation. Mental health professionals analyzed Jodi's behavior, with some diagnosing her with borderline personality disorder, characterized by intense and unstable relationships, fear of abandonment, and sudden shifts between idealization and devaluation of romantic partners. The case also raised questions about the role of religious guilt and sexual shame in relationships, as Travis and Jodi's inability to reconcile their sexual behavior with their Mormon beliefs appeared to contribute to the toxicity of their dynamic. Jodi Arias remains incarcerated in Arizona, where she has reportedly adapted to prison life, selling artwork and maintaining a presence through social media managed by supporters. She continues to maintain that she killed Travis in self-defense, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, and the case remains one of the most extensively covered murder trials in American media history. Number 7. Michael Mandell and Dr. Joseph Sonnier. A deadly conspiracy. Not all betrayals between friends involve direct violence. Sometimes the betrayal is even more calculated, involving manipulation and the use of others as instruments of murder. The case of Michael Mandell and Dr. Joseph Sonnier represents a particularly chilling example of how friendship can be weaponized when jealousy and romantic obsession override moral boundaries. In the affluent community of Lubbock, Texas, Dr. Joseph Sonnier was a respected pathologist known for his skill, his dedication to his patients, and his warm personality. In his late 60s, Dr. Sonnier had found love again with a woman named Rochelle Shetina, a divorced mother who had recently ended a long-term relationship. Their relationship brought happiness to Dr. Sonnier after years of being single, and friends described him as rejuvenated by the romance. What Dr. Sonnier didn't know was that Rochelle's ex-boyfriend, a successful attorney named David Shepard, was struggling to accept the end of their relationship and harbored intense resentment toward the doctor who had replaced him in Rochelle's affections. David Shepard had been in a relationship with Rochelle for several years, and by all accounts, their breakup had been difficult for him. While Rochelle had moved on relatively quickly, beginning her relationship with Dr. Sonnier within months, David remained emotionally attached and became fixated on the idea that Dr. Sonnier had stolen his girlfriend. Rather than processing his grief and moving forward, David began to plot revenge against the man he saw as responsible for his romantic loss. It was at this point that friendship became corrupted into something deadly. David Shepard had a close friend from college named Michael Mandell, a man who had struggled with financial problems and legal issues over the years. The two had maintained their friendship despite taking very different paths in life, with David becoming a successful attorney while Michael dealt with failed businesses and mounting debts. David recognized that Michael's desperate financial situation made him vulnerable to manipulation, and he began to plant the seeds of a murderous conspiracy. Over a period of months in late 2011 and early 2012, David Shepard convinced Michael Mandell that Dr. Sonnier was a dangerous person who posed a threat that needed to be eliminated. The exact nature of David's manipulation would later be debated at trial, but evidence showed that David offered Michael money, made promises about future financial support, and played on their friendship to convince Michael to commit murder on his behalf. For Michael Mandell, the combination of financial desperation, loyalty to his friend, and whatever story David fed him about Dr. Sonnier proved sufficient to override his moral compass. On July 10, 2012, Michael Mandell traveled to Lubbock, Texas, armed with a knife. He broke into Dr. Sonnier's home in the early evening, waiting for the doctor to return from work. When Dr. Sonnier arrived home, Michael attacked him in his garage, stabbing him multiple times in a brutal assault. The doctor, despite being in his late 60s, fought back desperately, and the struggle was intense. Neighbors reported hearing what sounded like a confrontation but didn't realize the severity of what was occurring. Dr. Sonnier died at the scene from multiple stab wounds, and Michael Mandell fled the area, returning to his home in Dallas. The murder investigation initially struggled to identify a suspect or motive. Dr. Sonnier had no known enemies, didn't appear to have been robbed, and the level of violence suggested a personal nature to the crime that didn't fit with a random break-in. Detectives began looking into Dr. Sonnier's personal life and quickly discovered his relationship with Rochelle Shetina and her previous relationship with David Shepard. When investigators interviewed David, he appeared cooperative and expressed surprise and sadness about Dr. Sonnier's death, but something about his demeanor raised suspicions. Meanwhile, forensic evidence from the crime scene eventually led investigators to Michael Mandell, whose DNA was found at the scene. When confronted, Michael initially denied involvement but eventually confessed to the murder. More importantly, he implicated David Shepard as the mastermind behind the killing, revealing the months of manipulation and planning that had preceded the attack. Phone records, text messages, and financial transactions supported Michael's account, showing extensive communication between the two men in the lead-up to the murder and payments from David to Michael that appeared to be compensation for the killing. The revelation that a successful attorney had orchestrated the murder of his ex-girlfriend's new boyfriend shocked the Lubbock community and the Texas legal establishment. David Shepard was arrested and charged with capital murder, specifically murder for remuneration, meaning he had paid someone else to commit the killing. Michael Mandell was also charged with capital murder, and the two men who had once been close friends now faced the possibility of execution for their roles in Dr. Sonnier's death. The trials were held separately, with Michael Mandell going first. Despite his cooperation with investigators and his confession, prosecutors argued that he had knowingly and willingly participated in a murder for money and that financial motivation didn't excuse his actions. Michael's defense team portrayed him as a desperate man manipulated by a more sophisticated friend, someone whose financial problems and loyalty were exploited by David Shepard. The jury found Michael Mandell guilty of capital murder, and in a surprising decision, sentenced him to death. The harshness of the sentence reflected the premeditated nature of the crime and the brutality of the attack on Dr. Sonnier, despite Michael's attempts to portray himself as a pawn in David's scheme. David Shepard's trial was more complex, as the prosecution had to prove that he had orchestrated the murder despite not being physically present. The evidence included testimony from Michael Mandell, phone records showing extensive contact between the two men, financial records indicating payments, and testimony from witnesses who heard David express hatred and resentment toward Dr. Sonnier. The defense argued that Michael Mandell was lying to save himself, that the payments were for legitimate business purposes, and that David had no motive to kill a man he barely knew. However, the jury found the evidence convincing, particularly when combined with testimony from Rochelle Shetina about David's inability to accept their breakup and his increasingly concerning behavior regarding her new relationship. David Shepard was convicted of capital murder in December 2014, and the jury sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The different sentences for the two men reflected the jury's view of their respective roles, with Michael as the actual killer receiving death and David as the manipulative mastermind receiving life. Both convictions were appealed extensively, with defense attorneys arguing various procedural and evidentiary issues. Michael Mandell's death sentence was particularly controversial, with some legal observers questioning whether someone who killed at another's behest should receive a harsher sentence than the person who ordered the killing. However, appellate courts upheld both convictions, finding that the evidence of guilt was overwhelming and that the trials had been conducted fairly. The case highlighted the dangers of allowing jealousy and resentment to fester after romantic relationships end, and the way that friendship bonds can be corrupted when one person manipulates another's vulnerabilities. Dr. Sonnier's family was left devastated, losing a beloved father, brother, and friend to violence that stemmed from romantic jealousy he likely didn't even know existed. Rochelle Shetina testified that she had no idea David harbored such intense resentment and that she never would have believed him capable of orchestrating murder. The friendship between Michael Mandell and David Shepard, which had lasted decades and survived many challenges, ultimately became the vehicle for a brutal murder that destroyed multiple lives. David Shepard remains incarcerated in Texas, maintaining his innocence and continuing to appeal his conviction. Michael Mandell remains on death row, though Texas has executed far fewer inmates in recent years, making it unclear when or if his sentence will be carried out. The case serves as a reminder that the bonds of friendship can be twisted into instruments of manipulation and that loyalty without moral boundaries can lead to tragic consequences. Number 6. Jennifer Pan and Daniel Wong. The fake kidnapping murder plot in the quiet suburb of Markham, Ontario, Canada. Jennifer Pan appeared to be the model daughter, a young woman who had achieved academic success, excelled at figure skating, and was devoted to her strict immigrant parents. Her friends admired her dedication to her family and her ability to balance multiple responsibilities. Among those friends was Daniel Wong, her boyfriend of several years and someone she turned to as her carefully constructed life began to unravel under the weight of lies and impossible expectations. What Jennifer's friends and family didn't know was that behind the facade of success was a web of deception that had been growing for years, and that Jennifer's closest relationship would ultimately become a conspiracy to murder her own parents. Jennifer Pan's parents, Han and Bitch Pan, had immigrated to Canada from Vietnam, and like many immigrant families, they had high expectations for their daughter's success. They pushed Jennifer academically, enrolled her in figure skating, and monitored her life closely, wanting to ensure she would have the opportunities they had worked so hard to provide. Jennifer responded by becoming what appeared to be an ideal daughter, earning top grades, competing in figure skating, and being accepted to the prestigious Ryerson University to study pharmacology. Her parents were proud, and Jennifer's extended family and community saw her as a success story. The truth, however, was far different. Jennifer had been lying to her parents for years, creating an elaborate fantasy life that required constant maintenance. She had not actually graduated from high school with honors as she claimed, had not been accepted to Ryerson University, and was not attending classes there. Instead, she had been spending her days at public libraries, cafes, and with friends, maintaining the charade of being a university student, while actually having no real academic or professional prospects. She forged report cards, created fake transcripts, and invented stories about her classes and professors, all to maintain her parents' belief that she was the daughter they had raised her to be. The stress of maintaining these lies intensified when Jennifer began a relationship with Daniel Wong, a young man her parents disapproved of due to his involvement in drug dealing and what they saw as his lack of ambition. Jennifer's parents, upon discovering the relationship, gave her an ultimatum: break up with Daniel or be disowned by the family. Jennifer appeared to comply, telling her parents she had ended the relationship, but in reality, she simply became more secretive, seeing Daniel while her parents believed she was studying or working. The double life became unsustainable, and in 2010, Jennifer's lies began to collapse. Her father discovered some of her fabrications, and her parents became increasingly suspicious and controlling, monitoring her communications and movements. Jennifer felt trapped, unable to confess the truth, but also unable to maintain the deception much longer. It was at this point, according to evidence presented at her eventual trial, that Jennifer began to consider a horrifying solution. If her parents were dead, she would inherit their house and money, and she would be free to live with Daniel without judgment or control. Jennifer confided in Daniel Wong about her desire to be free of her parents, and Daniel, rather than encouraging her to seek help or to simply leave home, began to help her plan their murder. Daniel had connections to individuals involved in criminal activity, and he contacted a man named Lenford Crawford, explaining that his girlfriend needed people killed and was willing to pay. Lenford agreed to participate and recruited two others, David Milvaganam and Eric Carty, to help carry out what would be staged as a home invasion. Over a period of months, Jennifer provided detailed information about her parents' routines, the layout of their house, and the best time to strike. The plan was calculated and cold, with Jennifer actively participating in arranging her parents' murder. On November 8, 2010, Jennifer put the plan into motion. She ensured that the doors of her parents' home were unlocked and that she knew where her parents would be in the house. Just after 10 p.m., 3 masked men entered the Pan home, quickly subduing Jennifer's father Han and her mother Bitch. Jennifer had planned to have herself tied up as well, to make it appear that she too was a victim of a home invasion. The intruders forced Han Pan to access his safe and hand over cash, then proceeded to carry out the execution phase of the plan. Jennifer's mother Bitch was shot multiple times and died at the scene. Her father Han was also shot multiple times, including in the face, but miraculously survived despite his severe injuries. Jennifer, who had been tied up loosely in a way that would allow her to free herself and call police, waited for the attackers to leave before calling 911 and reporting that her family had been attacked during a home invasion. The initial police response treated the case as a tragic home invasion, a violent crime that had left one woman dead and her husband critically wounded. Officers comforted Jennifer, who played the role of traumatized daughter convincingly, and began investigating what appeared to be a robbery gone wrong. However, as detectives reviewed Jennifer's statement and began to investigate more thoroughly, inconsistencies emerged. Jennifer's account of the evening changed in small ways between tellings. Some of her details didn't match the physical evidence, and her demeanor seemed unusual for someone who had just witnessed her mother's murder and her father's near death. Most importantly, as Han Pan recovered from his injuries, he was able to provide his own account of the attack, and his version contradicted Jennifer's in significant ways. Investigators began to suspect that Jennifer was not merely a victim but possibly a participant in the crime. They conducted a lengthy recorded interview with Jennifer, during which her story continued to evolve and detectives noted behaviors and statements that suggested deception. Phone records were subpoenaed, revealing extensive contact between Jennifer and Daniel Wong on the day of the attack, including a call made just before the intruders arrived. Financial records showed that Jennifer had access to money and had withdrawn cash in the days before the murder. As investigators dug deeper into Jennifer's background, they discovered the years of lies about her education and the secret relationship with Daniel, establishing a motive. Within weeks of the murder, police arrested Jennifer Pan, Daniel Wong, Lenford Crawford, David Milvaganam, and Eric Carty, charging all 5 with first-degree murder and attempted murder. The arrests shocked the community, with neighbors and family friends unable to believe that the seemingly devoted daughter had orchestrated her parents' murder. The trial, which took place over several months in 2014, revealed the full extent of Jennifer's deception and the calculated nature of the murder plot. Prosecutors presented phone records, witness testimony, and most damningly, Han Pan's testimony about what occurred that night, including his recollection that the attackers seemed to focus their violence on him and his wife while being unusually gentle with Jennifer. The evidence showed that Jennifer had not only planned the murder but had actively facilitated it, communicating with the killers, ensuring access to the home, and participating in the staging of her own fake victimization. Jennifer's defense team argued that she had been under extreme psychological pressure from her parents' expectations, that she suffered from dependent personality disorder, and that while she may have wished for freedom from her parents, she didn't actually intend for them to be killed. The jury rejected this defense, finding Jennifer Pan guilty of first-degree murder in her mother's death and attempted murder of her father. She was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Daniel Wong was also convicted of first-degree murder and received the same sentence, as did Lenford Crawford. The other 2 participants received slightly lesser sentences based on their more peripheral roles. The case devastated what remained of the Pan family, with Han Pan losing his wife and his daughter in one horrific night. He testified about the betrayal he felt, having dedicated his life to providing for Jennifer and having nearly died at her hands. The case sparked extensive discussion about the pressures faced by children of immigrant families, the dangers of academic pressure and unrealistic parental expectations, and the warning signs of troubled family dynamics. Mental health professionals noted that while Jennifer's situation was extreme, the pattern of lying to meet parental expectations combined with the inability to be honest created a pressure cooker that led to violence. Jennifer Pan and Daniel Wong remain incarcerated in Canadian federal prisons, with both having exhausted most of their appeals. Han Pan has spoken publicly about his loss and his complicated feelings toward his daughter, expressing that while he loved her, he could never forgive what she had done to his wife and to their family. Number 5. Brian Lee Draper and Tori Adamczyk. The Scream-inspired murder in the small town of Pocatello, Idaho. Two 16-year-old boys sat in a parked car with a video camera, discussing their plans to commit murder with an excitement typically reserved for planning a party or a school event. Brian Lee Draper and Tori Adamczyk had been best friends throughout high school, bonding over their shared interests in horror movies, particularly the Scream franchise, and their feelings of being outsiders in their school's social hierarchy. What began as typical teenage friendship had evolved into something far darker, with the two boys feeding off each other's violent fantasies until they decided to turn fiction into reality. On September 22, 2006, they would murder their classmate Cassie Jo Stoddard in an act that shocked the community and revealed how friendship can become a vehicle for collective violence when two disturbed individuals reinforce each other's worst impulses. Cassie Jo Stoddard was a popular and well-liked 16-year-old student at Pocatello High School, known for her kindness, her infectious smile, and her love of animals. She had been dating her boyfriend Matt Beckham for several months, and on the evening of September 22, 2006, the couple was house-sitting for Cassie's aunt and uncle, watching movies and enjoying a quiet evening together. Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk knew about Cassie's house-sitting plans because they had asked if they could come over to hang out and watch movies with the couple. Cassie, being friendly and unsuspecting, agreed, and the two boys arrived at the house that evening. What Cassie didn't know was that Brian and Tori had been planning her murder for weeks and had chosen this night specifically because they knew she would be alone in an isolated house. The boys had made multiple videos in the weeks leading up to the murder, documenting their plans and their excitement about committing what they called their masterpiece. In these chilling recordings, which would later be discovered by police, Brian and Tori discussed how they wanted to be like the killers in the Scream movies, how they would stab someone to death, and how they would get away with it. The videos showed two teenage boys who had completely divorced themselves from the reality and consequences of murder, treating it instead as an exciting adventure that would make them infamous. On the night of the murder, Brian and Tori arrived at the house and hung out with Cassie and Matt for a short time, watching a movie and acting like normal teenagers. At one point, the boys excused themselves, claiming they had other plans, and left the house. Matt also left shortly after, leaving Cassie alone in the house. What Cassie didn't realize was that Brian and Tori had not actually left. They had unlocked a door during their visit and had hidden outside, waiting for everyone else to leave. Once they were certain Cassie was alone, they re-entered the house through the unlocked door. The boys had armed themselves with knives, and they had turned off the power to the house to create an atmosphere of fear similar to what they had seen in horror movies. Cassie, alone in the dark house, called her boyfriend Matt, expressing fear that something was wrong and that she thought she heard noises. Matt tried to reassure her, telling her it was probably just the old house settling, and promised to come back if she was really scared. Before Matt could return, Brian and Tori attacked Cassie in a prolonged and brutal assault. The medical examiner would later determine that Cassie had been stabbed 29 times, with wounds covering her body as she desperately tried to defend herself and escape her attackers. The attack was frenzied and savage, lasting several minutes as Cassie fought for her life against two people she had considered friends. After Cassie was dead, Brian and Tori fled the scene, stopping at a local restaurant to establish an alibi and acting as though nothing had happened. When Matt returned to the house later that evening after Cassie stopped answering his calls, he made the horrific discovery of his girlfriend's body. The investigation into Cassie's murder moved quickly once detectives began interviewing students at Pocatello High School. Multiple classmates mentioned that Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk had been acting strangely in the days before the murder, talking about violence and serial killers, and some students even mentioned that the boys had talked about wanting to kill someone. When detectives interviewed Brian and Tori, both initially denied any involvement, claiming they had been at the house earlier but had left before Cassie was killed. However, forensic evidence told a different story. The boys had left footprints at the crime scene that matched their shoes, and more importantly, when police searched their belongings, they discovered the video recordings the boys had made documenting their murder plans. The videos were among the most disturbing pieces of evidence investigators had ever encountered. In one video recorded just hours before the murder, Brian and Tori sat in a car discussing their excitement about killing Cassie. Brian looked directly into the camera and said they were about to go kill someone and that he was nervous but excited. Tori expressed similar sentiments, and both boys discussed how they would dispose of evidence and avoid getting caught. The videos showed no remorse, no hesitation, and no recognition that they were about to take an innocent life. Instead, the boys treated the murder as though it were a performance, something they were doing to achieve notoriety and to live out the fantasy violence they had consumed in movies. Faced with overwhelming evidence, both Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Their trials, held separately in 2007, revealed the extent of their planning and their complete lack of empathy for their victim. Prosecutors presented the video evidence, forensic evidence from the crime scene, and testimony from classmates who described the boys' obsession with violence and their desire to be famous killers. The defense teams for both boys argued that they were immature teenagers who had been overly influenced by violent media and didn't fully understand the consequences of their actions. However, the prosecution successfully argued that the extensive planning, the deliberate choice of victim, and the boys' own words on video demonstrated that they knew exactly what they were doing and had chosen to commit murder for the thrill of it. Both Brian Lee Draper and Tori Adamczyk were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 30 years before being eligible for parole. The judge in both cases expressed shock at the callousness displayed by the defendants and noted that their friendship had created a folie à deux, a shared psychosis where two individuals feed off each other's delusions and escalate to behaviors neither might have engaged in alone. Cassie Jo Stoddart's family was devastated by the loss of their daughter and by the senselessness of her murder. Her mother, Anna Stoddart, became an advocate for victims' rights and spoke publicly about the need for parents and educators to recognize warning signs when teenagers become obsessed with violence. The case raised questions about the influence of violent media on young people, though experts noted that millions of teenagers watch horror movies without becoming murderers and that Brian and Tori's actions stemmed from deeper psychological issues that existed before their media consumption. The friendship between Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk represented a particularly dangerous dynamic where two individuals with violent ideation found each other and reinforced those thoughts until they acted on them. Psychologists who studied the case noted that having a partner in crime often makes it easier for individuals to commit acts they might not commit alone, as the shared responsibility diffuses guilt and each person's participation encourages the other. Both Brian and Tori remain incarcerated in Idaho state prisons, where they are housed in separate facilities. Appeals of their convictions have been unsuccessful, with courts finding that the evidence of premeditation was overwhelming and that their sentences were appropriate given the calculated nature of the crime. The case continues to be studied in criminal justice programs as an example of how adolescent friendship can become deadly when both parties share violent fantasies and neither provides a moral check on the other's worst impulses. Number 4. Diane Zamora and David Graham. The cadet killers the United States military academies represent excellence, discipline, and honor, producing officers who will lead the nation's armed forces. In 1995, the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis accepted Diane Zamora, a brilliant young woman from Texas who had achieved the rare distinction of being accepted to one of the most competitive institutions in the country. That same year, the U.S. Air Force Academy accepted her boyfriend David Graham, an equally accomplished young man who shared Diane's ambition and drive. The couple, who had been high school sweethearts in the Dallas area, seemed destined for success and appeared to embody the values of discipline and integrity that the academies sought to instill. However, beneath their polished exteriors lay a toxic relationship built on obsession, control, and ultimately, a willingness to commit murder to preserve what they saw as their perfect bond. The trouble began in the fall of 1995, when David Graham, while still a senior at Mansfield High School in Texas and before leaving for the Air Force Academy, had a brief sexual encounter with a fellow student named Adrienne Jones. Adrienne was a popular 16-year-old who was involved in the school's drill team and had dreams of becoming a nurse. David's encounter with Adrienne was reportedly a one-time event that occurred at a party, and David later claimed it meant nothing to him. However, consumed by guilt over his infidelity to Diane, David made the fateful decision to confess to Diane about what had happened. What he didn't anticipate was the intensity of Diane's reaction and her determination that the only way to cleanse their relationship of this betrayal was through violence. According to both David and Diane's later confessions, Diane became obsessed with Adrienne Jones after learning about the encounter. She couldn't accept that David had been unfaithful, and she convinced herself that Adrienne was a threat to their relationship and their future together. Diane reportedly told David that Adrienne had to die, that it was the only way they could move past the betrayal and restore the purity of their relationship. David, rather than recognizing this as the dangerous delusion it was, agreed to participate in Adrienne's murder. The couple spent several weeks planning the killing, discussing various methods and locations, and ultimately deciding they would lure Adrienne out under false pretenses and kill her in a remote location. On December 4, 1995, David called Adrienne and asked her to meet him to talk. Adrienne, who had no reason to fear David and believed they were simply going to have a conversation, agreed to meet him. David picked up Adrienne in his car, with Diane hiding in the back seat. They drove to a remote area near Joe Pool Lake in Grand Prairie, Texas, where Diane emerged from her hiding place and attacked Adrienne with a barbell weight, striking her in the head multiple times. When Adrienne didn't immediately die from the assault, David, at Diane's urging, shot Adrienne twice with a gun they had brought for this purpose. The couple then dumped Adrienne's body in a wooded area and drove away, believing they had committed the perfect crime. Adrienne Jones's body was discovered the next day by a group of people walking in the area. The brutality of the attack was immediately apparent, and detectives launched a major investigation into her murder. Initially, investigators had few leads, as there appeared to be no obvious motive for anyone to want to kill Adrienne. She had no known enemies, wasn't involved in any high-risk behaviors, and by all accounts was simply a normal teenager. The case grew cold over the following months, with no significant breaks despite extensive investigation. Meanwhile, David Graham had left for the Air Force Academy, and Diane Zamora had begun her studies at the Naval Academy. Both appeared to be thriving in their new environments, excelling academically and physically, and giving no outward sign that they had committed murder. However, the psychological burden of what they had done began to manifest in different ways. David reportedly struggled with nightmares and guilt, while Diane seemed to view the murder as a necessary sacrifice that had preserved their relationship. The break in the case came in August 1996, nearly 9 months after the murder, when David Graham confessed to a roommate at the Air Force Academy that he and Diane had killed someone. The roommate initially didn't believe David, thinking he might be joking or trying to seem tough, but David's detailed account and obvious distress convinced the roommate that the confession was genuine. The roommate reported the conversation to Academy officials, who immediately contacted law enforcement in Texas. When investigators interviewed David, he provided a full confession, describing how he and Diane had planned and carried out Adrienne's murder. Diane was arrested at the Naval Academy shortly after David's confession, and she too eventually confessed to her role in the killing, though her version of events differed from David's in key respects. Diane claimed that David had been more involved in the actual killing than he admitted, while David insisted that Diane had been the primary aggressor and had pressured him into participating. Both agreed, however, that the murder had been planned and that both had participated in luring Adrienne to her death. The arrests of 2 promising military academy cadets for the murder of a high school student sent shockwaves through the military community and the Dallas area. The case became national news, with media outlets fascinated by the story of 2 high-achieving young people who had thrown away their futures by committing a senseless murder. The trials revealed the twisted logic that had led to Adrienne's death, with prosecutors presenting evidence that Diane Zamora had been consumed by jealous rage and had manipulated David Graham into participating in murder. David Graham went to trial first in July 1998. The prosecution argued that David had actively participated in planning and executing the murder, that he had fired the fatal shots that killed Adrienne, and that his guilt over infidelity did not excuse his decision to commit murder. David's defense team tried to portray him as being under Diane's psychological control, arguing that Diane's obsessive personality had overwhelmed his judgment. However, the jury found David guilty of capital murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. Diane Zamora's trial took place several months later, and prosecutors faced the challenge of proving that Diane had been the driving force behind the murder despite not having fired the fatal shots. The evidence included testimony about Diane's obsessive personality, her history of controlling behavior in her relationship with David, and most importantly, the confessions both defendants had made describing Diane's role in planning the murder and attacking Adrienne with the weight. Diane's defense team argued that she had been a teenager in love who had made a terrible mistake under emotional duress, but the jury rejected this argument. Diane Zamora was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison, also with the possibility of parole after 40 years. The case left Adrienne Jones's family devastated and struggling to understand why their daughter had been killed. Adrienne's mother, Linda Jones, spoke at both trials about the loss of her daughter and the senselessness of a murder committed simply because of teenage jealousy and obsession. The case also prompted both military academies to review their screening processes, though officials noted that nothing in either David or Diane's background had suggested they were capable of violence. Both Diane Zamora and David Graham remain incarcerated in Texas prisons, where they have reportedly adapted to prison life. They are housed in separate facilities and are not permitted to communicate with each other. Both have expressed remorse for their actions in various parole hearings and interviews, though they remain decades away from being eligible for release. The case has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and television programs, all exploring how two high-achieving young people with seemingly bright futures could commit such a brutal crime. Psychologists who have studied the case note that the relationship between Diane and David exhibited characteristics of folie à deux, where two people in a close relationship share delusional beliefs and reinforce each other's pathological thinking. The case serves as a tragic reminder that intelligence and achievement do not preclude moral failure, and that obsessive relationships can lead even promising young people to commit terrible acts. Number 3. Ryan Hoas. A marriage planned for murder in the suburban community of Brighton, New York. Ryan Hoas and his wife Stacy appeared to have an ideal marriage and a close friendship that had begun in their teenage years. The couple had known each other since high school, where they had been part of the same social circle, and their relationship had evolved from friendship to romance to marriage. Friends and family described them as devoted to each other, and Ryan was known as a supportive husband who was deeply involved in his wife's life. However, behind closed doors, Ryan Hoas was living a double life that would culminate in one of the most calculated and cold-blooded murders in Rochester area history. The friendship and then marriage between Ryan and Stacy had always seemed solid to outsiders, but by 2013, cracks had begun to show. Ryan had become involved with another woman and wanted to end his marriage, but he faced a significant obstacle. His wife Stacy was pregnant with their child, and Ryan knew that a divorce would result in child support obligations and the division of assets. Rather than accepting these consequences as a normal part of ending a marriage, Ryan began to consider a more permanent solution. He decided that if Stacy were dead, he could be with his girlfriend without the financial and legal complications of divorce, and he began to plan her murder with a level of detail that shocked investigators when they eventually uncovered the plot. Ryan's plan relied on staging Stacy's death to look like a tragic accident or random crime. Over a period of several months in 2013, Ryan researched various methods of murder, searched online for information about how investigations are conducted, and attempted to establish alibis and create circumstances that would deflect suspicion from himself. He was methodical and calculating, treating the murder of his wife as though it were a complex problem to be solved rather than the taking of a human life. On August 26, 2013, Ryan put his plan into action. That morning, Stacy Hoas, who was 7 months pregnant, was found dead in her home, having been beaten to death with a blunt object. The crime scene initially appeared to support Ryan's claims that an intruder had broken into their home and killed Stacy while he was away. However, investigators from the Brighton Police Department immediately noticed inconsistencies in Ryan's account and in the physical evidence at the scene. The forced entry appeared staged, valuable items that would typically be taken in a burglary were left untouched, and Ryan's emotional responses seemed inappropriate for someone who had just lost his pregnant wife. Detectives began conducting a thorough investigation into the Hoas' background and quickly discovered Ryan's extramarital affair. They also uncovered Ryan's internet search history, which revealed searches for terms like how to commit murder, how long does a murder investigation take, And can police trace deleted files? The digital evidence painted a picture of a man who had been planning his wife's murder for months and who had researched how to avoid detection. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered that Ryan had purchased life insurance policies on Stacy worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in the months before her death, providing a clear financial motive in addition to his desire to be free to pursue his relationship with his girlfriend. Forensic analysis of the crime scene revealed that the attack on Stacy had been brutal and personal, with the medical examiner determining that she had suffered multiple blows to the head that had caused fatal injuries. The pattern of injuries was inconsistent with a random attack and suggested someone who had wanted to ensure Stacy was dead. Blood spatter analysis indicated that the killer had spent significant time at the scene and had attempted to clean up evidence, behaviors more consistent with someone trying to stage a scene than with a burglar who had been interrupted. Within days of the murder, investigators had gathered sufficient evidence to arrest Ryan Hoas. He was charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder, one for Stacy and one for their unborn child, and the community that had known Ryan and Stacy was shocked by the revelation that the grieving husband was actually the killer. Friends who had comforted Ryan after Stacy's death felt betrayed and horrified when they learned that he had murdered the woman they thought he loved. Ryan's girlfriend, when interviewed by police, claimed she had no knowledge of Ryan's plans and had believed him when he said he was going to divorce Stacy. The trial of Ryan Hoas began in 2014 and lasted several weeks. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of premeditation, including the internet searches, the life insurance policies, testimony about Ryan's affair, and forensic evidence from the crime scene that contradicted Ryan's claims of a break-in. The prosecution argued that Ryan had befriended and married Stacy only to betray her in the most fundamental way possible, murdering her when she became an obstacle to his desires. Expert witnesses testified about the staged nature of the crime scene and the impossibility of Ryan's timeline of events. Ryan's defense team attempted to create reasonable doubt by suggesting that the real killer had not been caught and that the evidence against Ryan was circumstantial. However, the combination of motive, opportunity, digital evidence, and forensic analysis proved insurmountable. The jury found Ryan Hoas guilty on both counts of second-degree murder after deliberating for less than a day. During the sentencing phase, Stacy's family provided emotional victim impact statements, describing the loss of both Stacy and her unborn child and the additional trauma of learning that someone they had trusted and welcomed into their family had committed these murders. The judge sentenced Ryan Hoas to 50 years to life in prison, meaning he would not be eligible for parole until he had served 50 years. The judge, in imposing the sentence, noted the calculated nature of the crime, the breach of trust involved in murdering one's spouse, and the fact that Ryan had killed not only Stacy but also their unborn child. The case highlighted how friendship and romantic relationships can mask dark intentions, and how even people who seem devoted and caring can be capable of terrible violence when their self-interest is threatened. Stacy Hoas's family has worked to keep her memory alive and has advocated for domestic violence awareness, noting that Stacy showed no outward signs of being in danger and that Ryan's violence came without warning. Ryan Hoas remains incarcerated in New York State, where he continues to maintain his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. The case serves as a reminder that the people closest to us, those we trust most completely, can sometimes be the most dangerous when their mask of friendship and love conceals murderous intent. Number 2. Cinnamon Brown and Patty Bailey. A father's manipulation. The concept of friendship and betrayal takes on additional complexity when family relationships are involved, and few cases illustrate this more dramatically than the murder of Linda Brown in Garden Grove, California, in 1985. At the center of this case were 3 individuals: David Brown, a manipulative man who controlled everyone around him, his 14-year-old daughter Cinnamon, and his wife's younger sister Patty Bailey, who was 17 and living in the Brown household. David Brown had cultivated relationships with both girls that blurred the lines between parental care and psychological manipulation, creating a twisted dynamic where both Cinnamon and Patty competed for his approval and affection. What appeared to outsiders as a blended family with close relationships was actually a carefully constructed web of manipulation that David would use to convince one of these girls to murder his wife. David Brown had married Linda Brown, and the couple lived with Cinnamon, David's daughter from a previous relationship, and Patty Bailey, Linda's younger sister. David was a con artist and manipulator who had convinced both Cinnamon and Patty that he loved them in ways that went beyond normal family affection. He played the two girls against each other, creating jealousy and competition for his attention, while simultaneously complaining to both of them about his wife Linda. David told Cinnamon and Patty that Linda was abusing him, that she was planning to kill him to collect insurance money, and that she was the source of all the family's problems. None of these claims were true, but David was skilled at manipulation and knew how to prey on the insecurities and loyalty of two teenage girls who desperately wanted his approval. Over a period of months, David escalated his manipulation, telling both girls that the only way to save him and preserve their family was to kill Linda. He framed the murder as an act of love and protection, convincing the girls that they would be heroes for saving him from his evil wife. On March 19, 1985, 14-year-old Cinnamon Brown shot and killed her stepmother Linda Brown while Linda slept in her bed. The murder weapon was a gun that David Brown had provided, and the plan was one that David had carefully orchestrated. After shooting Linda, Cinnamon took pills in what was supposed to appear as a suicide attempt, part of David's plan to make it look like Cinnamon had acted alone in a moment of mental instability. When police arrived at the scene, they found Linda dead from a gunshot wound, David Brown appearing distraught, and Cinnamon semi-conscious in a trailer in the backyard. The initial investigation seemed straightforward. A troubled teenage girl had killed her stepmother and then attempted suicide. Cinnamon was arrested and charged with murder, and because of her age, she was sent to a juvenile facility. She maintained that she had acted alone and that no one else had been involved in the murder, protecting her father as he had instructed her to do. David Brown played the role of grieving husband and devastated father, telling investigators and family members that he couldn't understand why Cinnamon had done this terrible thing. However, detectives from the Garden Grove Police Department were suspicious of David's story and his behavior. Something about his emotional responses seemed off, and investigators noticed that David seemed more concerned with controlling the narrative than with grieving his wife or worrying about his daughter. As they dug deeper into the family dynamics, they began to uncover the disturbing truth about David Brown's manipulation of both Cinnamon and Patty. The case broke open when investigators interviewed Cinnamon extensively after she had been incarcerated for several years. As Cinnamon matured and gained distance from her father's influence, she began to realize that she had been manipulated and used. In 1988, 3 years after the murder, Cinnamon contacted investigators and told them the truth: that David Brown had planned the entire murder, that he had convinced her to kill Linda by telling her that Linda was going to kill him, and that he had promised Cinnamon she would only spend a short time in juvenile detention before he would find a way to get her out. Cinnamon revealed that David had practiced the murder scenario with her multiple times, had provided the gun, and had told her exactly how to stage the scene to make it look like she had acted alone. Armed with Cinnamon's testimony, investigators reopened the case and began looking more closely at David Brown and Patty Bailey. They discovered that shortly after Linda's murder, David had married Patty, suggesting that the murder may have been motivated by David's desire to be with his wife's younger sister. Financial records showed that David had collected on Linda's life insurance and had been living comfortably while his daughter remained incarcerated. Investigators also learned that David had been telling Patty the same lies he had told Cinnamon, playing the two girls against each other and using their devotion to him for his own purposes. When confronted by police, Patty Bailey eventually admitted that she had known about the murder plan and had actually been present in the house on the night of the murder, though she claimed she had not thought David was serious about having Cinnamon kill Linda. Patty testified that David had convinced her that Linda was abusive and dangerous, and that she had believed they were protecting David. However, evidence suggested that Patty had been more involved than she initially admitted, and that she had helped David manipulate Cinnamon into committing the murder. David Brown was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, and Patty Bailey was charged as an accomplice. The trial revealed the full extent of David's manipulation and his complete lack of remorse for using his own daughter as a weapon to kill his wife. Prosecutors presented testimony from Cinnamon, who described in heartbreaking detail how her father had convinced her that killing Linda was an act of love and loyalty. Expert witnesses testified about manipulation and psychological abuse, explaining how David had created a dynamic where both girls were desperate for his approval and willing to do anything he asked. David Brown was convicted of first-degree murder in 1990 and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Patty Bailey, who cooperated with prosecutors and testified against David, received a reduced sentence and was eventually released from prison. Cinnamon Brown's sentence was reduced in light of her cooperation and the recognition that she had been a victim of her father's manipulation. She was released from custody in the 1990s after serving several years in juvenile detention and adult prison. The case became one of the most notorious examples of parental manipulation leading to murder and highlighted how abusers can weaponize the trust and loyalty of young people. The friendship and family bonds between Cinnamon, Patty, and David had been corrupted by David's narcissism and manipulation, with Linda Brown paying the ultimate price. Mental health professionals who studied the case noted that both girls had been groomed and psychologically abused by David Brown over a period of years, making them vulnerable to his suggestions and unable to recognize that they were being used. The case also raised questions about the criminal justice system's response to juvenile offenders who commit crimes under the influence of adult manipulators, with many arguing that Cinnamon should never have been charged as the primary perpetrator given her age and the circumstances of the manipulation. David Brown remains incarcerated in California, where he has reportedly shown no remorse for his actions and continues to claim that he was the victim of false accusations. Cinnamon Brown has rebuilt her life after release, though she has spoken about the lasting trauma of being manipulated into murdering her stepmother and the complicated feelings she has about her father. The case serves as a chilling reminder that the people who should protect us can sometimes be our greatest danger, and that friendship and family loyalty can be twisted into instruments of violence when placed in the hands of a skilled manipulator. Number 1. Stephen Sweppel. The perfect neighbor's dark secret. In the quiet Iowa City neighborhood where Stephen Sweppel lived with his family, he was known as the friendly neighbor, the devoted father, the loving husband, and the trusted friend to many in the community. Stephen worked as a financial officer for Hills Bank and Trust Company, a respected position that put him at the center of the community's financial life. His wife Cheryl was a stay-at-home mother who volunteered at their children's school, and their 4 children were active in sports and academics. The Sweppels appeared to embody the American dream, and Stephen's friendships in the community seemed genuine and deep. However, behind this facade of suburban perfection, Stephen Sweppel was hiding a terrible secret that would ultimately lead him to betray not just his friends and employer, but his own family in the most horrific way imaginable. Stephen Sweppel had been embezzling money from Hills Bank for years, systematically stealing from the institution that had trusted him with its finances and from the community members who were his friends and neighbors. The embezzlement scheme was sophisticated and had gone undetected for a significant period, allowing Stephen to maintain his lifestyle and his reputation even as he stole hundreds of thousands of dollars. Stephen used his position and the trust others placed in him to access accounts and manipulate records, all while presenting himself as a model employee and upstanding citizen. His friends at the bank and in the community had no idea that the man they trusted was systematically betraying them. In early 2008, Stephen's embezzlement was discovered during a routine audit. Bank officials were shocked to find that Stephen Sweppel, one of their most trusted employees and someone many considered a friend, had stolen approximately $560,000 over a period of several years. Stephen was confronted with the evidence, and it became clear that his carefully constructed life was about to collapse. He was placed on administrative leave from the bank, and criminal charges were imminent. Stephen knew that he faced significant prison time, that his reputation would be destroyed, that his family would be disgraced, and that everyone he knew would see him as a thief and a fraud. Rather than facing the consequences of his actions, Stephen Sweppel decided on a course of action so horrific that it shocked even experienced investigators who thought they had seen the worst of human behavior. On March 23, 2008, Stephen Sweppel murdered his entire family in their home. He used a baseball bat to kill his wife Cheryl and their 4 children, Ethan age 10, Seth age 8, Mira age 5, and Eleanor age 3. The murders were brutal and prolonged, with each family member suffering multiple blows. After killing his family, Stephen wrote a suicide note in which he expressed remorse for the financial crimes he had committed, but framed the murders as a way to spare his family from the shame and difficulty they would have faced after his arrest. Stephen then got into his car and drove to Interstate 80, where he deliberately drove at high speed into a concrete pillar, killing himself instantly. The discovery of the murders sent shockwaves through Iowa City and the surrounding communities. When Stephen failed to appear for a meeting related to the embezzlement investigation, authorities went to his home for a welfare check and made the gruesome discovery of 5 bodies. The suicide note left by Stephen provided an explanation for what had occurred, but nothing could make sense of why a father would murder his own children rather than allow them to live with the consequences of his crimes. Friends and neighbors who had known the Swepels were devastated and struggled to reconcile the friendly, caring Stephen they thought they knew with the man who had committed such unspeakable acts. The investigation revealed that Stephen had been living a double life for years, presenting one face to the world while hiding his criminal activities and, ultimately, his capacity for violence. Co-workers at Hills Bank who had considered Stephen a friend felt betrayed twice over, first by his theft of money that belonged to the bank and its customers, and second by the revelation that he had murdered his innocent family rather than facing justice. The community held vigils for Cheryl, Ethan, Seth, Mira, and Eleanor Swepel, mourning 5 innocent lives lost because of one man's selfishness and cowardice. Mental health professionals and criminologists who analyzed the case noted that Stephen Swepel exhibited characteristics of narcissistic personality disorder, particularly in his inability to accept responsibility for his actions and his willingness to destroy his family rather than face public humiliation. The case highlighted a phenomenon known as family annihilation, where a family member, typically the father, murders his spouse and children before killing himself. These cases often occur when the perpetrator faces a major life crisis, such as financial ruin or exposure of criminal behavior, and decides that death is preferable to facing the consequences. What makes these cases particularly tragic is that the victims are almost always innocent parties who would have survived and potentially thrived despite the crisis, but the perpetrator's narcissism and inability to see his family members as separate individuals with their own right to life leads to their murder. The betrayal in the Swepel case operated on multiple levels. Stephen betrayed his employer and his professional colleagues by stealing from them while maintaining the appearance of friendship and trustworthiness. He betrayed his community by violating the trust they had placed in him as a financial officer and as a neighbor. Most profoundly, he betrayed his wife and children, who loved and trusted him completely, by choosing to murder them rather than allowing them to live. Friends who had spent time with the Swepel family in the weeks before the murders reported that Stephen had seemed stressed and distracted, but had given no indication of being dangerous. The case raised questions about whether warning signs had been missed and whether the tragedy could have been prevented if Stephen's embezzlement had been discovered earlier or if someone had recognized his mental state as dangerous. Hills Bank and Trust Company was left to deal with the financial losses from Stephen's embezzlement and the emotional trauma of learning that a trusted colleague had betrayed them. The bank implemented new oversight procedures and worked to reassure customers that their money was safe, but the damage to the institution's reputation and the psychological impact on employees who had considered Stephen a friend was significant. The case serves as a sobering reminder that we can never truly know what exists in the hearts and minds of even our closest friends, and that the personas people present to the world can mask terrible secrets and even more terrible intentions. The Swepel murders remain one of the most tragic cases in Iowa history, a stark example of how one person's moral failure and inability to face consequences can destroy multiple innocent lives and shatter entire communities.